It's war. Trade war. But what does it mean for you, your family, the United Kingdom, or even the world economy? My name's Tom Harwood and this is GBN Money. Well, we now know the tariff schedules that Donald Trump has imposed upon the wider world. We know the baseline 10% tariff that the UK has been stuck with, the 25% tariffs on all automotive imports into the United States, but the higher tariffs for other countries, the 20% experienced by the European Union, or even higher for East Asian fast-growing economies like Vietnam or Cambodia. But what exactly is happening with regard to the UK consumer? What is happening with regard to the wider financial markets? Because some people now predict a recession. Yes, let's zoom over to the United States for a moment and think about what the impact of these tariffs are, because all a tariff is an import tax. It becomes more expensive for the United States to import any good created in any country other than the United States. But it's not just completed goods, it's also components for goods that are made in the United States. So unless the entire production chain is brought in-house, then things are going to get more expensive. And it's unlikely that entire production chains are going to be moved into a single country basis. This is one of the fundamental reasons why economists are now predicting higher inflation in the United States and potentially job losses and a recession to boot. Because even though it will be more attractive for an American to buy an American car as of today than it was just a week ago, it will be more expensive to make that car in America, as well as more expensive to import a car from a third country. So the consumer in America has to spend more of their money on the same product they were buying before. That means there's less discretionary spending, less economic activity, and a slowdown in growth, potentially even a recession. But how on earth were these taxes arrived at? How did this tariff calculation play off? In his famous board that Donald Trump brandished outside the White House in the Rose Garden this week, he claimed that countries around the world were imposing stratospherically high tariffs on the United States. He said that the European Union was imposing, for example, 39% tariffs on the United States. But economists have drilled down into these numbers and into these calculations, and it doesn't seem as it first did. The tariff rate the EU applies to the US is not 39%. The 39% number has been arrived at by the Trump White House by looking at the trade deficit between the United States and the EU and running numbers through that trade deficit. How much more does the EU sell to the US than the US sells to EU countries? That calculation is then brought into a percentage figure to claim that that is the level of tariff. But it's not the level of tariff, it's the level of free choice. And a trade deficit with one particular country is not necessarily a bad thing for the United States. This is something that Donald Trump has run up against with regard to mainstream economic opinion. Donald Trump thinks that he needs to have a trade surplus with every single country around the world. But that doesn't quite make sense. I, as an individual, might have a trade deficit with the shop that I go to, but I have a trade surplus with my employer. What does that mean? My employer pays me money, and I spend money in a shop. Similarly, the United States could have a trade surplus with one country and a trade deficit with another country. That doesn't mean that the United States is being ripped off. That means that they're choosing to buy more from one country and sell more to another. That's a free trading global economy. That is a free market. And yet the United States has been walking back from that principle of free markets and free trade. Not because the rest of the world charges the tariffs that Donald Trump claimed that they did on the United States, but because of these trade imbalances that Donald Trump sees as a bad thing. But that is the effect on the United States. It's going to become more expensive to buy just about everything. That is definitely a tax. That is a detriment to the United States economy. Donald Trump says that in the long term, that's going to bring home manufacturing. And it might. There might be more manufacturing in the United States than there otherwise would be. But the question is, what will the United States be losing? The more money that has to be spent on manufacturing in the United States could have been spent on other things in the United States. That is what economists call an opportunity cost. Having to spend money on something more than you were before removes the opportunity that you spend some of that money on something else. And that necessarily makes the economy smaller than it otherwise would be. It's also what's known as concentrated gains but dispersed losses. So if the automotive industry in the United States gains $10 billion, but the rest of the economy, the entire rest of the economy loses $10 billion, you're not going to see that in such a concentrated way. There'll be a way for a politician to run off to a plant and say, look, we kept this plant open. But you won't be able to see so easily the economic losses that are spread out across the rest of the economy. You'll only be able to collect that in data in aggregate. And that's why superficially these tariffs have in the past seemed appealing to many politicians. But again, well outside of the mainstream of economic opinion. Because generally, the more customers you have, the more sellers you have too, the more competition there is, the more efficiency is driven in the market. The more can be produced, the more innovation takes place, the less lazy producers get. We've seen this in the past with subsidized industry. The United Kingdom had a sclerotic time from the end of the Second World War up until the revolution that Margaret Thatcher brought in. Why did the UK's industry degrade so much throughout the 1960s and 1970s? Well, because we subsidized it and nationalized it. We reduced the amount of competition that it was subjected to. And that meant that working practices got lazier. That meant that there was no drive to innovate, to stay at the forefront of the field. And tariffs do exactly the same thing. That's why Ronald Reagan referred to protectionism instead as destructionism. Those who try to protect industry by insulating it from foreign competition actually sow the seeds for its own destruction. They mean that that sort of innovation and those sorts of companies do not innovate. Those sorts of companies degrade and crumble over time because they are not kept on their toes, because they are not constantly thinking about that next competition and how to make themselves more efficient. That sort of protectionism crumbles those countries and those companies. That's why Ronald Reagan tried to repeal tariffs that were destroying so many industries in the United States in his view. But that is the United States perspective. What does it mean for the United Kingdom? Haven't we got off lightly with the lowest tariff that Donald Trump is charging of any country? 10% tariffs across the board on United Kingdom imports. Well, it's not getting off lightly compared to the situation last week. Last week, of course, we enjoyed many different sectors of the economy that had zero tariffs with regard to exporting to the United States. So it is still a worse situation than before. Some economists are saying this could wipe out the headroom that Rachel Reeves needed in her budget. Will we have to have more tax rises to try and meet Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules now that it's more expensive for Americans to buy British goods? They'll buy fewer British goods. But it's not just the 10% tariffs that have been slapped on the UK that will affect the UK. Think about the countries that the UK buys goods from. But we don't put extra tariffs on these goods. Why are those goods becoming more expensive? Because these days, goods aren't made in one place, in one country. Supply chains are complicated and hop from country to country to country. If there was a good that was finalized in Vietnam, it might have components from Laos. It might have components from India. Now, if all of these different countries have tariffs slapped on them from the United States, and there are trade flows between the United States and these countries, well, that means any good made in those countries could be more expensive, even if it's being exported to the United Kingdom. That means our exports not just from the United States, but from many other countries that are entangled in this complicated and almost beautiful web of trading flows and just-in-time delivery mechanisms. My goodness me, if United States tariffs break up and fragment those trade flows, that doesn't just affect our trade with the United States, it affects British trade with just about every other country around the world. Now, there is a silver lining for the United Kingdom, and that is the type of economy we are. Overwhelmingly, the United Kingdom is a service-based economy rather than a goods-based economy. Now, the world of trade in goods is going to become very rocky as this trade war progresses, as countries retaliate against the United States by raising their own tariffs, as things become harder to move from one place to another. That's tough on goods. But Donald Trump didn't, seemingly, apply trade tariffs to services. So it seems that the bulk of the United Kingdom economy will not be so affected. Our financial services, the premier place the United Kingdom has in the insurance market, all of these services, IT services and the like, we could be basically where we were before. Now, that's not to say that goods don't affect all of that. Of course, on the round, it's been a negative. But one final silver lining to leave you with here. Unlike many other countries around the world, unlike Canada, Mexico, the European Union, the United Kingdom has so far chosen not to respond with retaliatory tariffs. That means the UK is not slapping on, at least for now, extra taxes on American goods that are being imported to the United Kingdom. Many countries are doing this out of revenge for US tariffs. They're making US imports to their countries more expensive. But many economists would say that that is simply fighting fire with fire. If you're angry that the United States has made your goods more expensive in their country, why, if you're saying that that's illogical and that makes goods more expensive for American consumers as well as worse for your exporters, why on earth would you put tariffs on American imports, raising the prices of goods in your own country for your own people? It's just like war. This is why people call it a trade war. No side wins. All sides lose gold. All sides lose treasure and blood. And that is what we're seeing with this tariff war. But the UK might be one of the lesser countries affected, still affected, but one of the lesser countries affected because we are choosing so far not to retaliate with further antagonistic tariffs. Hopefully that can keep goods cheaper than they otherwise would be in the UK, and frankly also not attract the ire of Donald Trump. Well, what do you make of this seismic event, this announcement from the White House Rose Garden, this new time of high trade tariffs around the world? Almost 30% average tariffs for the United States. That's higher than they have been in 100 years. That's higher than the disastrous Smoot-Hawley tariffs during the Great Depression that economists now almost universally assess to have elongated that Great Depression in the United States in the 1930s. Higher tariffs even than then. Well, do get involved in the comment section below. What are your thoughts? Or is this all just a bargaining ploy? An expensive and destabilizing bargaining ploy at that? But perhaps that's what some in the Trump circle try to argue it is. Do remember to subscribe to the GB News YouTube channel for more analysis, more news, and more up-to-date information like GBN Money.